Takeline is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy's Pick'em game. Just pick over or under on your favorite or least favorite player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it incredibly simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Just set it and forget it. Sign up now with the code TAKELINE and you'll double your first deposit up to $100 in bonus cash when you make your first deposit of $10 or more. Deposit $100, get $100 free. Sign up and play today. In 1972, Title IX was enacted to protect students from sex-based discrimination in any school or in any other educational program that receives funding from the federal government. 50 years later, the argument can easily be made that it must be strengthened in order to better serve and protect a more diverse spectrum of students and definition of sexual identity. Here to discuss the legacy of Title IX as well as its future is Rachel Axon, an investigative sports reporter with USA Today. Rachel, welcome to Takeline.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yay, thank you so much for being here. I want to start with a zoom out and a macro view of Title IX. Last week was the 50th anniversary, and it seemed like it was a party and we were celebrating and we were talking about the history, but what are some of the circumstances in this country that led to the law originally being enacted, and what is this law supposed to protect?
So the simplest version is it protects from discrimination on the basis of sex at any school that receives money from the federal government. Public school, private school, it's a broad range. It's kindergarten all the way up through graduate schools. And when it was first envisioned, they meant to address, women not being allowed to get into graduate programs. And nobody kind of foresaw the effect that it's had on sports and on athletics. And I think it's fair to say the landscape we're in today would be virtually unrecognizable to anybody in 1972 when they were first seeking to pass this law. It's obviously most well known for its impact on sports and athletics, although its protections apply much more broadly than that. When the law passed, there were fewer than 30,000 collegiate athletes who were women, and then fewer than 300,000 high school athletes who were women. That's now more than 3.4 million girls competing in high school and more than 219,000 women competing in the NCAA. So certainly in terms of opening the doors, the opportunities, and then you look and you see the ripple effects, right? The skills, the lessons, the things that we all know are good about sports for men, women are reaping those benefits. And so, there's a study that showed 94% of women in the C-suite had background in athletics. Certainly I wouldn't have my job, right? If it's not acceptable for women to play, it's certainly not acceptable for women to write about them. So there's so many ways in which it's opened the doors, and the increase of opportunity has really changed things for women and girls.
Yes, that is a beautiful description of it. I played college basketball. I would not have been able to with the scholarship without Title IX. And I did a story recently on the 37 Words documentary that ESPN just dropped. And it was kind of surprising that it started in education. I think sports is so forward facing. So a lot of people thought that was the anchor of it, but it was education, because it's kind of the blanket statement of education, and sports fit into that. I always found that interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a realization pretty immediately after it passed, because it says any program or activity. So this protects you if you were in the marching band, or if you're in a STEM program, or whatever other program or activity a school might sponsor. And in the 70s, they started to realize, like, oh, this might affect sports. And so you saw all these attempts to pass amendments to exempt football or exempt revenue producing sports, things like that, that I think they realized pretty quickly after it passed that this was going to have an impact. But even then, it still has taken, decades to do that.
Yes. And I want to talk about your work, too, and what you did for USA Today. You and your colleague recently carried out a lengthy report on athletic programs at the nation's top colleges and universities. What were some of your findings, and specifically regarding roster inequalities on campuses?
Sure. So we've been working on this for more than a year, looking at different parts of, compliance or ways schools can be measured with the law. Most recently, we came out with a story looking at proportionality. And there's a way that schools can show compliance with how many opportunities they're giving women. If your school's 60% women, then your athletic opportunities should be roughly close to that. And what we found is 87% of schools in the FBS could not show that. We're not even close. Collectively, 110 schools would need to add 11,501 opportunities for women to get there. There's two other ways they can show compliance, but those are very difficult, as we outline in our reporting. So just in terms of even being able to get on the field, it's still very difficult at the highest levels. And, we focused in on these colleges and university because they're the ones that people know, right?
Yeah.
It's Michigan, it's Wisconsin, it's, all these, Alabama, all these schools that we highlighted. And so rather than actually giving women those opportunities, many schools are sort of rigging the numbers to make it look more like they are. And so we dug into different sort of roster manipulation tactics to see how they're doing that. The first one is double and triple counting women to a far, far greater degree than they do the men. So the federal government says if you have one athlete and that person participates in more than one season or more than one sport, then they can count more than once. But what that does is if you have a female distance runner, she's now 2 to 3 times as valuable as her male counterpart because she can count in cross country, indoor track and field, outdoor track and field. And so we see schools inflating their women's rosters and then multiplying them, even though they may not compete very much. It's not necessarily the same kind of opportunity. So as an example, cross country is a sport where you count 5 runners. At Florida State, they had 13 men on their cross country team in the year that we looked at and 43 women. And so far more than they need.
Yeah.
But then you take that and you multiply it, and it certainly looks like they're offering women more opportunities than they are. Another way schools do this, the ones that have rowing, we've seen overwhelmingly tend to stuff their rosters with novice or new athletes who don't really ever get a chance to compete, don't show up, by the time spring season rolls around. That's fairly common. And then the other one that stood out is the federal government under a related law allows schools to count male practice players as female participants for the teams they practice with. So very commonly, and you may know this from your time play, women's basketball will have male practice players that they practice against. When that gets reported to the federal government, they just count those. And so it looks like there's more women. And there's a little caveat box in the data that explains how many men count. But when we looked at it and did all these comparisons, we found that at least a quarter of the female basketball players reported to the federal government at these schools were male practice players. So
a quarter? Oh my gosh.
Yes. So when you add all those means of manipulation up, these schools collectively added more than 3,600 opportunities for women without adding a single new team. And so they can make their numbers look better. And everyone asks, why do they do that? And the reason is to avoid scrutiny. People still don't have a lot of awareness about Title IX, their rights under it, how to exercise those rights. But if you do know that and you go to the only place where there's publicly available numbers and they look better, then that may deter you from filing a federal complaint with the Department of Education, which anybody can do, or filing a federal lawsuit against the school. So we know that there's a big gap in opportunities, and instead of closing that gap in opportunities, they are just making it look like it's not as bad as it is.
Wow. I also had that question to the why. Is there a financial reason for them to not provide? Well, there's always money involved somehow. So how does money play into this, I guess, is the bigger question. Well,
that's obviously a huge factor, and that gets into some of our other reporting. We're looking at FBS schools, football bowl subdivision. These are the biggest football schools, and almost without exception, they devote the most resources in terms of personnel, scholarships, money, et cetera, to one or two men's sports, right? Football and men's basketball. But But you don't need to have, there's nothing in Title IX that says you have to give the women's volleyball team with 16 members the same amount of money that you give the men's football team with 116 members.
Right.
But there are things that the law requires in terms of treatment. Like once you get them on your campus, you can't just like give one team the Taj Mahal and have the other one playing in the parking lot type stuff. Mm-hmm. And so the federal government has a list of 11 items. It's called the laundry list, where they'll go in and they'll assess a school. How equitable is the publicity, the recruiting money, the access to medical care, all down this list. And so we, during the Final Four, studied this and looked at the same FBS schools for equipment, travel, and recruiting money. And we just looked at comparable teams. So if a team has a men's basketball team and a women's basketball team, men's soccer, women's soccer, we picked 6 sports where there was a balance in that. And between them, we found in those 3 categories, for every dollar that those schools spent on the men's team, they spent 71 cents on the women's team. When you add that up over the 2 years that we looked at, it was a difference of $125 million just in those 3 categories.
Wow.
I think the one thing that will stick out to me, and I can't tell you how many times we talked about this example, the University of Louisville in basketball spent 13 times as much for the men on equipment as it did for the women in that 2-year period. Now, some of it is shared, so it's not like a totally true reflection they explained to us, but there's a lot that was not. Mm-hmm. In one purchase that they went to a sporting goods store, the men's team spent $2,500 on socks. That amount is more than 10%, of what the women's team spent on equipment, period, for the 2 years. And the men are spending it on socks. Yes. So you see this difference in treatment, and it doesn't necessarily mean these schools are for sure out of compliance, because there's a whole, they would be assessed on the whole program. But if you have these really big gaps and red flags on sports that are similar, it's kind of hard to see how a school could offset that by, we treat the football team really well, but then we also treat, softball, rowing, and women's lacrosse really well. Like it gets a lot harder to do. So Those were some pretty big red flags in regards to Title IX compliance.
And you know what else sticks out to me? The women's team was way better than the men's team. So they can have their money with their socks, but the women were at the Final Four about to win a national championship.
Well, and that was one of them. The UConn women, right? Gino Auriemma, the legendary coach of the team, later said, we have everything we need. But I think we found around $1.2 million more spent on the men's team in those areas than on the women's team, which is kind of shocking, right? Like UConn women are the standard in women's basketball. Gino's contention was, I don't need to recruit like they do, which is probably fair. That program.
Classic Gino. If that was a quote from Gino Auriemma, yes. Classic.
Yes. And that they travel different. Yeah. And this we saw a lot where the men's team will always charter, have a bigger travel party, things like that. And the women's team might fly commercial and go with a smaller group, stuff like that. So when you add it all up, it's a lot of big differences, even at the programs where the women are really, really good.
Yeah. And we talked about how, the history of it, and I feel like you and your colleague did an amazing job of showing yes, this is an equity law, but there's still things that aren't equal, and we still have a lot of work to do. And recently, President Biden has said that Title IX needs to be strengthened in order to overhaul the Trump-era guidance on how schools handle sexual assault cases, too, under Title IX. Is there a real plan to do so, or was this just politicking on the anniversary?
No, there is a real plan. So what we've seen in regards to enforcement of the law, and this applies to all areas, as you mentioned, it covers sexual misconduct. Mm-hmm. It covers protections for pregnant students. It covers protections now that, the Biden administration has clarified for LGBTQI plus students. Mm-hmm. So it's very broad in that regard. We see it go back and forth. The pendulum swing under Democratic administrations. It tends to be more of a focus on enforcement, less so under Republican administrations. And under the Trump administration, the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, passed some rules that basically limited the scope of cases that schools have to respond to when they learn about sexual assault. And, victims advocates said, really we're meant to deter reporting and give rights to accused students. This is going back the other way now. Yeah. It's a process. It takes time in the rulemaking to, they'll put out their regulations. There'll be a comment period. And then they have to follow this sort of stricter process. So it's harder to undo than some of the other things the department does, just issuing a letter of guidance. Mm-hmm. But they have started the process, and that's what they announced last week.
Okay. I'll
it's
take it.
It's going to be a while, but they have started. Yeah.
They have started. And it is, as an anniversary, any type of anniversary comes up, we do focus on it. So I'm happy that there are things that are actually taking place and not just saying, hey, things need to change and not doing anything. But going back to what you're saying about the colleges, I just curious, like, how does the NCAA president, Mark Emmert, factor in all of this? Like, what is he doing or not doing? Because we know NCAA can be a little shady sometimes, to push gender equality forward. What is he doing? Do we know? Is he EMMY?
That's a great question. So technically speaking, the NCAA does not have an obligation under Title IX. There's actually a Supreme Court case about this, where because they don't directly receive federal funding, then they're not obligated by the law. They're not bound by the law. Others have argued all of their members, they are made up of the schools. All of their members are. But so they are not. And we've obviously seen the gender equity issues with the NCAA tournament a couple years ago. Sedona Prince highlighting all of the issues there. And then they, commissioned this law firm to study it. But the NCAA, as an organization, effectively has not played a role in schools complying with this. They used to have, starting in the 90s to 2011, this process where schools, in order to be members, had to be certified and come up with a range of plans. So they had to assess how they were doing on gender, how they were doing on race, and several other things. Do a report, give it to the NCAA, and the NCAA would say yes or no. To my knowledge, they never didn't certify a school. They would just look at it and say, well, fix this. But there was at least something that the NCAA was doing that said, like, are you providing like equitable opportunities based on gender? When Mark Emmert came to the NCAA, they ended that. It has never come back. So they don't, other than, sort of encouraging it informally, they don't have a role and they're not bound by the law. I think there's, some people in Congress, especially those who have been involved in the, questions about amateurism and NIL, those sorts of things, who would like to see that change. Yeah. I don't know how much support there would be for that within Congress, but they don't necessarily have a role. Certainly we need greater enforcement from the government and other places, but if we want this to keep living up to the law's promise, the NCAA is not going to lead us there.
Not surprising to me on some sense, but for the last question, I think kind of looking towards the future, is there a world in which Title IX protections are ever repealed? I don't want to think of, I don't know. I want it to be changed, but could we be living in the world given Friday's horrendous Supreme Court decision where things change and not for the better?
I think I could never predict that, right? Like, this is certainly well-established law. I think maybe the thing in favor of that not happening is that there's not a lot of enforcement of it now. We're continuing our reporting, the whole team of us at USA Today, and we'll be looking at sexual misconduct and specifically looking at enforcement. And this law is there, but effectively, there's no consequence for breaking it. And what started us on this project was, experts and people we talked to around athletics and just another reporting, everyone saying, like, they're not complying. Of course they're not complying. Nobody's complying. What are you talking about? Yeah. And just accepting it is like this kind of like widespread understanding and everyone just kind of knows it. And so we went out to like test that. How true is that? Can we show that if that's the case? And as we do our reporting, that's really backing this up. Part of the problem is the Department of Education that investigates this Its Office for Civil Rights is really underfunded, really understaffed. They primarily respond to complaints that they get. So unless something filters up to the point of a complaint, it's really, not going to be on the radar. And then even when they do those, they take a long time. They get the school to sign a resolution agreement that says, like, we promise we will fix XYZ or whatever. And then it still takes years to do. So if you're a student who's been discriminated against, you're probably gone by the time anything does get fixed, if it does get fixed. Yeah. The only sanction they have is to revoke federal funding from the school, which has not happened in 50 years. And the schools know this. So there's no cost for them to not comply. Where we've seen greater success is through lawsuits. But again, that's got significant barriers. A student's got to know they're being discriminated against, have the wherewithal to go through with a lawsuit. Those still take time to go through. And so it's really, really difficult given that, we have the law as of right now. I don't think it's going anywhere, but it's also not being enforced in a way that's really making schools live up to the, if not the letter, then at least the intent of it.
Yeah. Well, I know that we still have a long way to go, but we have if this anniversary has taught me anything, the 50 years of Title IX it is okay to look back of how far we've come. And there has been extreme progress in, since the 70s, since this law was passed. But the next 50 years, I hope there is much more progress and much great things. And your work is really pointing to that. So thank you for all that you do. And she is Rachel Axon, investigative sports reporter in USA Today. Rachel, thank you so much for your time and being here on Takeline.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.